Hey, what do you think you're doing?
I'm just watering our garden, sir.
Who gave you permission to be on this property?
This is my house. I live
Don't lie to
here.
me. The family that lives here doesn't look like you.
My mom's inside. You can ask her.
Drop the hose, now.
I didn't do anything wrong.
I said step back.
Yo, what's going on out here? Why'd you just put your hands on my sister?
Officer Bob Finn, a patrol officer with 10 years on the Maplewood Heights Police Department and a documented history of racially motivated stops in the city's wealthier neighborhoods, was driving through Cedarwood Lane on a warm Tuesday afternoon when he spotted a black 14-year-old girl in a full school uniform, watering flowers in the front yard of a house he had already decided she couldn't possibly own, and immediately concluded she was trespassing. Finn pulled over. He walked across the lawn. He refused to believe her when she told him she lived there. He told her, "You don't live here. Stop lying." He demanded ID from a child who was standing in her own front yard, in her school blazer, holding the garden hose her late grandmother had used every spring, because the color of her skin told him everything he thought he needed to know. When 14-year-old Kisha Mandala tried to explain that she didn't carry ID because she was 14 years old and her mother was 30 feet away inside the house, Finn dismissed her. When she couldn't immediately answer fast enough through her fear and confusion, he called her hostile. And when Kisha flinched and stepped back, Finn raised his hand and slapped her across the face. On her own driveway, in front of her grandmother's roses, in her school uniform, at 14 years old. What Officer Finn did not know was that the entire incident had been recorded from the moment he crossed the lawn by Mrs. Adeze Okafor, a retired schoolteacher who lived next door and had her phone out before Finn even opened his mouth. What he did not know was that Kisha's mother, Katie Mandala, had heard her daughter scream and was already running through the front door. And what he especially did not know was that Kisha's older brother, Abel Mandala, a former Division I linebacker, currently in his second year of law school, with a memory like a court transcript, was pulling into that same driveway 10 minutes later. Finn's decision to assault a child on her own property that Tuesday afternoon would result in his immediate suspension, his termination within the week, a federal civil rights lawsuit, criminal charges for assault on a minor, and a settlement that would follow his name for the rest of his life. All delivered not by a protest, not by a politician, but by a law student who arrived home, assessed the situation in under 60 seconds, and began to speak. Before we go any further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. And if you believe a 14-year-old girl should be able to water her grandmother's flowers in her own yard without being slapped by an officer who refused to believe she lived there, like this video and subscribe. Cedarwood Lane in Maplewood Heights on a warm Tuesday afternoon looked exactly the way quiet suburban neighborhoods are supposed to look. Manicured lawns, sprinklers running on timers, driveways lined with family cars. The kind of street where neighbors knew each other's names and children rode bikes to the end of the block without their parents worrying. The kind of street where, if you saw a police cruiser rolling slowly past, you assumed someone had reported a loose dog. Kisha Mandala stood in her front yard at 4:12 in the afternoon, right where she had been standing for the past 15 minutes, watering the rose bushes that lined the front walkway of her family's home. She was 14 years old, a freshman at Maplewood Academy. She had ridden the school bus home 40 minutes earlier, dropped her backpack on the porch steps and gone straight to the garden, still in her full school uniform, navy blazer and all, because the sky had that heavy pre-rain look, and her grandmother had always said roses needed water before a storm. The roses were Kisha's responsibility now. Her grandmother, Doris Mandala, had tended that garden for 11 years before she got sick. Through every season, through every hard winter and late frost, she had kept those roses alive. Pink ones nearest the walkway, red ones against the fence, white ones closest to the porch that she said reminded her of her own mother's yard. When Doris got too weak to kneel in the garden herself, she had sat in the wooden chair by the porch and directed Kisha from a distance, teaching her which stems to cut back, which roots needed deeper water, which roses were her favorites. Doris Mandala had died 7 months ago, and every day since, without missing one, Kisha had carried the hose to those roses. It was the way she felt close to her, the way she heard her grandmother's voice in the smell of wet soil and blooming petals, the way she kept a piece of Doris alive in something growing and real. Today she hadn't even changed out of her uniform. The roses couldn't wait. Her grandmother wouldn't have waited. She was watching the water arc over the pink roses, making sure it reached the roots the way she'd been taught, when she heard tires slow to a stop at the curb. She looked up. A police officer was getting out of his cruiser. Not casually, not with the relaxed energy of a man doing a routine check. He was moving with purpose. He walked across the lawn toward her, and something in the way he moved, fast, certain, his hand already resting on his belt before he had said a single word, made Kisha's stomach clench with a fear she couldn't name, but had been taught to expect. Her mother had talked to her about this. Stay calm, be respectful, don't make sudden movements, answer clearly. Her mother had also told her, quietly, carefully, in the way that black mothers tell their children true things that shouldn't have to be true, that sometimes even when you do everything right, it doesn't matter. Officer Bob Finn was 41 years old, with 10 years on the Maplewood Heights Police Department, and a personnel file that told a story no supervisor had ever bothered to read to the end. Over the course of his career, Finn had accumulated 7 formal complaints from black and Latino residents across the neighborhoods he patrolled. All of them documented, all of them claiming the same things, that Finn had stopped people without cause, treated them like criminals before he had a single fact, assumed they didn't belong in the houses they owned or the yards they were standing in. 3 of the complaints used the same phrase. He assumed I was hired help. All 7 complaints had been reviewed. All 7 had been dismissed. They sat in his file like a forecast that no one had chosen to believe. Finn reached the edge of the flower bed, looked down at Kisha, 14 years old, school uniform, garden hose, grandmother's roses, and did not ask a single open question. His mind was already made up. He had seen what his bias told him to see, a black girl in a yard she didn't belong in. He had never been made to pay the price for being wrong. He had no reason to believe today would be different. "Hey," his voice was flat and immediate. "What are you doing on this property? Who authorized you to be here?" Kisha blinked. Authorized. Like she needed a permission slip to stand in her own yard. "I live here," she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "I'm watering the flowers. This is my house." Finn's expression didn't soften. It hardened. He looked at her the way people look at something they've already decided is a lie before they've finished hearing it. "No, you don't," he said. "Stop lying. Show me some ID." Kisha felt her hands go cold around the hose. The water was still running. The roses were still there. Her grandmother's favorites, right there in front of her. And a man with a badge was standing in her yard, telling her she didn't live there, looking at her like she was a problem he had already solved. "I don't have ID," she said. "I'm 14. My mom is inside." She pointed toward the front door. "I can get her. She can tell you." "Don't move," Finn said. "Don't go anywhere. And put the hose down." Kisha hesitated, not out of defiance, but out of the pure, paralyzed confusion of a child who had done absolutely nothing wrong and could not understand why that wasn't enough. And in that half-second of hesitation, Officer Bob Finn looked at a 14-year-old girl standing in her grandmother's garden in her school uniform and decided she was being hostile. What happened next would be captured on video. What happened next would be seen by millions of people. What happened next would end Bob Finn's career and begin the most consequential 10 minutes of Abel Mandala's law school education. Cedarwood Lane was the kind of street that made people slow down when they drove through it, not because of traffic, but because of the trees, old oaks that arched over the road like a cathedral ceiling, throwing long shadows across the pavement in the late afternoon. The houses sat back from the sidewalk on wide, quiet lots. Flower beds lined the front walkways. Sprinklers ticked softly in the distance. Everything about the street said settled, safe, home. Kisha Mandala had lived on Cedarwood Lane her entire life. She knew which neighbor's dog barked at bikes. She knew which stretch of sidewalk had the crack that caught your wheel. She knew these roses, every single one of them, by the way her grandmother had taught her to know them. She stood in the front yard at 4:12 in the afternoon, still in her full school uniform, navy blazer crisp, plaid skirt barely wrinkled from the school day, white knee socks pulled straight. Her backpack sat where she dropped it on the porch steps 20 minutes earlier. She hadn't even gone inside. The sky had that heavy, yellowed look that came before a late spring rain, and her grandmother's voice was already in her head. "Water them before the storm, baby. Rain alone isn't enough." So she watered. She moved the hose slowly across the flower beds, watching the water darken the soil around each stem, making sure it reached the roots the way she'd been shown. Pink roses near the walkway, red ones against the fence, the white ones closest to the porch that Grandma Doris had loved most. Doris Mandala had been gone 7 months. But standing here, in the smell of wet earth and blooming petals, Kisha could still feel her. She wasn't ready to let that feeling go. Officer Bob Finn had been patrolling Maplewood Heights for 10 years, and in that decade, he had developed a certainty about the neighborhoods he worked that he mistook for experience. He knew these streets. He knew the houses, the cars in the driveways, the faces that belonged on which lawns. He had convinced himself that this knowledge made him good at his job, that the instincts he had sharpened over a decade of patrol were the same thing as accuracy, that the quick reads he made in the first 3 seconds of seeing someone, before a single word was exchanged, was something close to professional wisdom. Nobody had ever made him prove it. Over 10 years on the force, Finn had collected 7 formal complaints from Black and Latino residents across Maplewood's wealthier neighborhoods. 7 people who had gone through the trouble of filing paperwork, writing statements, describing in careful detail what it felt like to be stopped, questioned, and treated like a criminal while standing in their own driveways or walking to their own mailboxes. 3 of those complaints used nearly identical language. He assumed I was hired help. He didn't believe I lived there. Every complaint had been reviewed. Every one had been dismissed. They sat in his personnel file like chapters of a story no supervisor had bothered to read past the first page. Each one a warning, each one ignored. And with every dismissal, Finn had received the same quiet confirmation. His instincts were fine. His methods were fine. He was fine. So on a warm Tuesday afternoon, when Bob Finn turned his cruiser onto Cedarwood Lane and saw a young black girl in a school uniform standing in the front yard of one of the street's nicest homes, his instincts did exactly what 10 years of zero consequences had trained them to do. They told him she didn't belong there, and he believed them completely. He saw her before he'd even fully turned onto the street, a young black girl, standing in the front yard of 114 Cedarwood Lane, holding a garden hose, school uniform, navy blazer, plaid skirt, white socks, backpack on the porch steps. She was facing the flower beds, moving the hose slowly across the roses, completely unbothered, the posture of someone who had done this 100 times before. Finn's foot eased off the accelerator. His brain was already working, already constructing the story it preferred. A house like that, wide lot, fresh paint, professional landscaping, belonged to the kind of family that hired people for yard work. And a teenage girl in a school uniform, out here in the middle of the afternoon with a garden hose, clearly wasn't the homeowner. She was probably the housekeeper's daughter, maybe a neighbor's kid using the tap without asking, maybe something else entirely. He didn't once consider that she might live there. The thought didn't form. It had no pathway to form through the assumptions stacked in front of it. Assumptions built over 10 years of patrols, of seeing Cedarwood Lane as a particular kind of place, belonging to a particular kind of family, and of never once having been told he was wrong. His mind had a template for what this street looked like, who stood in these yards, who held these hoses. Kisha Mandala didn't fit it. He pulled to the curb, cut the engine, sat for just a moment, watching her through the windshield. She still hadn't noticed him. She was focused on the roses, adjusting the angle of the water, careful and deliberate, the way someone who cared deeply about something moved around it. Finn saw none of that. He opened the door and got out. Kisha heard the footsteps when he was halfway across the lawn. She looked up, and her stomach dropped before her mind had fully processed why. A police officer was walking toward her. Not strolling, not approaching the way someone does when they mean no harm. Walking with the locked-in stride of someone who had already decided what was happening and was simply arriving to confirm it. His hand rested on his belt. His eyes were fixed on her. She turned to face him fully, the hose still running at her side. "Hey." His voice carried no greeting in it. "What are you doing on this property? Who said you could be here?" Kisha blinked. "I live here," she said. "This is my house. I'm just watering the flowers." Finn looked at her the way people look at a wrong answer. "No, you don't," he said flatly. Stop lying. You got ID? The question landed like something physical. She felt her chest tighten. I don't carry ID, she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could. I'm 14. My mom is inside. She can come out and tell you. I didn't ask about your mom. I asked for ID. He took a step closer. Put the hose down. Kisha's hand went still. The water dripped from the nozzle into the soil, slow and quiet, onto her grandmother's roses. She set it down carefully. Her hands were trembling now, though she was trying hard not to let them. This is my house, she said again, softer this time, almost a plea. I promise. I live here. Finn looked at her with an expression that had no room left in it for what she was saying. We'll see about that, he said. What happened next took less than 4 seconds. Finn reached out and grabbed Kisha's arm, hard, the grip of a man who had stopped thinking about what he was doing and was running purely on the authority he had never been taught to question. I said, don't move, he said, pulling her forward. Stop being difficult. I'm not, Kisha started, and then his hand came up. The slap cracked across the quiet afternoon air like a struck match. Kisha's head snapped sideways. She staggered, one foot twisting into the flower bed, and her knee grazed the edge of the low garden border as she caught herself. The roses beside her shook from the impact of her stumble, the white ones, Grandma Doris's favorites, petals trembling, a single bloom bending toward the soil. For a moment, the whole street was silent. Kisha stood hunched, one hand pressed to her face, her breathing coming in sharp, shallow pulls. She didn't cry out immediately. The shock was too complete for that, the kind of shock that empties a person before the pain arrives. She was still in her school uniform, still in her grandmother's garden, still, technically, doing nothing wrong. Across the street, a front door had opened 30 seconds earlier. Mrs. Adeze Okafor, 63 years old and retired after 30 years of teaching, had noticed the patrol car from her living room window the moment it stopped at the curb. Something in the way the officer moved across the lawn had made her step onto her porch. Something in Kisha's posture had made her reach back inside for her phone. She had been recording for 45 seconds when the slap landed. She didn't lower the phone. Her hand was completely steady. Katie Mandala was in the kitchen when she heard it. Not the slap itself. The walls were thick and the afternoon was quiet in the way suburbs go quiet midweek, that muffled, insulated stillness. What she heard was what came after. A sharp, broken sound from the front yard, high and short and wrong in the specific way that a mother's body recognizes before her mind catches up. She was moving before she had finished processing it. Her phone skidded off the counter. She didn't stop for it. She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, came through the hallway, and hit the front door with both hands, pushing through onto the porch, and what she saw stopped her for exactly 1 breath. Kisha was bent forward at the edge of the flower bed, one hand pressed to her face, her shoulders shaking, still in her school uniform, still in her grandmother's garden, and standing over her, close, too close, was a police officer whose body language carried none of the posture of someone who had just made a mistake. He looked like a man waiting to see what came next. The sound that came out of Katie Mandala did not begin as a word. It was a scream, full-throated, involuntary, the kind that doesn't ask permission, and it tore down the length of Cedarwood Lane with enough force that 2 neighbors came to their windows, and one man 3 doors down stopped mid-stride on his driveway. Then the words came. "That is my daughter." Her voice dropped into something lower and more dangerous than the scream. She was already off the porch, already crossing the yard. "That is my child. Don't you touch her. Don't you touch her again." Finn turned around slowly. He did not look sorry. The silver sedan turned onto Cedarwood Lane at 4:24 p.m. It pulled into the driveway with the unhurried ease of someone who had made that turn 10,000 times, and Abel Mandala stepped out carrying a casebook under one arm and his keys loose in his other hand. He was 23 years old, 6'4", with the kind of build that never fully leaves a man who spent 4 years as a starting linebacker, broad through the shoulders, deliberate in the way he moved, like someone who had learned long ago that his size alone changed the temperature of a room. He took in the scene in the time it took him to close the car door. Kisha at the flower bed, hands still at her face, his mother crossing the yard, voice tight with a fury she was barely containing. A uniformed officer standing in the middle of it all, with the stiff posture of a man who had not yet admitted to himself that things had gone wrong. Abel walked over, unhurried, completely calm. "What's your badge number?" he said. Not a question, an opening statement. Finn blinked. "Excuse me. Badge number. I need it for the complaint." Abel set his casebook on the hood of his car and pulled out his phone. "The incident has already been recorded by a witness across the street. I can see her still filming from here. I want to make sure I have your identifying information before I call my supervising attorney." The color shifted in Finn's face. "You put your hands on a 14-year-old child on her own residential property," Abel continued, his voice never rising above conversational. "That's criminal assault on a minor. That's a Fourth Amendment violation. And that," he nodded toward Mrs. Okafor's unwavering phone across the street, "is your career ending in real time." Finn said nothing. For the first time all afternoon, he had nothing to say. Finn's hand moved to his radio. It was the only play he had left. Call for backup, reassert control, make this someone else's problem to sort out. His jaw was set, and his eyes had gone hard in the way of a man who had confused doubling down with strength every time he'd ever been cornered. "I'm going to need you to step back," he said to Abel, "right now." Abel didn't move. "You can call whoever you need to call," he said. "So can I." He was already dialing, phone to his ear, one hand in his pocket. 3 rings. Then a voice on the other end, calm and professional. "Professor Daniels, it's Abel Mandala. I'm at my family home on Cedarwood Lane. I need 60 seconds. He put it on speaker. What followed was not a performance. It was a recitation. Precise, sequential, devastating. Abel walked Professor Daniels through every material fact in the order it had occurred, without embellishment, without emotion, the way he had been trained to present facts before they became arguments. The professor's response was immediate and unambiguous. Abel thanked him, ended the call, and looked at Finn. 2 squad cars turned onto Cedarwood Lane 4 minutes later. The officers who stepped out knew Finn, had worked alongside him for years. But Mrs. Okafor was already crossing the street with her phone extended, and what was on that screen, 45 seconds of clear, unobstructed footage, required no interpretation. One officer watched it twice. Then he looked at Finn with an expression that had nothing collegial left in it. The conversation that followed was brief. Finn's badge was secured. He was placed on immediate administrative suspension, pending investigation, while still standing in the yard he had terrorized 20 minutes earlier. The roses were still blooming behind him. The video was online before sunset. Mrs. Okafor had uploaded it herself. No caption, no commentary, just 45 seconds of unedited footage and the address of the Maplewood Heights Police Department in the description. By midnight, it had been viewed 2 million times. By the following morning, the number had tripled, and the name Bob Finn was no longer contained to Cedarwood Lane. Abel filed the civil rights lawsuit 4 days later. He did it methodically, the way he did everything, with Professor Daniels in the room, with his mother's signed testimony, with Mrs. Okafor's original footage preserved and time-stamped, with a 40-page complaint that documented not just the events of that Tuesday afternoon, but every one of the 7 prior complaints that Finn's department had chosen to ignore. The lawsuit named Finn personally. It named the department. It named the supervisors who had signed off on each dismissal. It was, his professor told him quietly, one of the cleanest civil rights filings he had seen in 20 years. Bob Finn was terminated within the week. His pension was forfeit. Criminal charges, assault on a minor, civil rights violation under color of law, were filed 30 days after that. The settlement, when it came, was substantial. His name became a reference point in the kind of conversations no officer wanted their name attached to. He never wore a badge again. On a Thursday morning 6 weeks later, Kisha Mandala came home from school, dropped her backpack on the porch steps, and picked up the garden hose. The roses were blooming well, the white ones especially, Grandma Doris's favorites, full and bright and unbothered by anything the season had thrown at them. Kisha watered them slowly, the way she had been taught. She was smiling.